Our final issue in the Mighty Marvel Western event has 6 stories in it this time around, so I need to move fast. These episodes have been fairly long. But before I begin, I need to quickly examine something strange about this comic. So far, each issue's cover has starred the book's lead story. Kid Colt and Arizona Girl, The Black Rider, and Two Gun all had the cover and the lead story at the same time, even if the Black Rider didn't have his book named after him, given that he appeared in Strange Western. But today's issue, Western Legends, stars Red Wolf on the cover, but he doesn't star in our lead story. Red Wolf is perhaps the most famous of our 3 stories that we're going to be reading, and I would argue that he is easily the coolest looking character featured in this issue, so there are reasons for him to get the spot. It is also possible that cover artist Eric Powell just wanted to draw Red Wolf. Normally, when an artist does cover work, they submit a number of sketches, called thumbnails, of prospective ideas to whoever is editing the book. The editor will then pick the cover that they think works best, the editor will create the cover, and eventually the cover will see publication and end up in our hands. So, out of all of the characters that we are going to be reading about today, Red Wolf's image and visual language may have just been the most unique or the most striking, or it may have just spoken to the editor out of all of the potential thumbnails that Powell could have submitted. I certainly dig it. This cover is easily the most throwback-y out of the 4 that we have in this streak of comics, featuring small pictures of the characters going down the left side of the page, plus we've got the normal cover blurbs, plus the rest of our cover standards, like the title, the Western event banner going across the top, and the corner publication box. But all of that salesmanship limits Red Wolf's space on the cover, trapping the character in a relatively small part of it. The throwback left-hand stack of characters idea is neat, but it does come with that one drawback. Alright, let's get this podcast moving. My name is Ben, and this is Comic Book Breakdown, episode 19.14, Western Legends. Our opening story is The Man Called Hurricane, and it was written by Jeff Parker, drawn by Tom Coker, and was colored by Matt Hollingsworth. The story is narrated by Little Cloud, a teenage girl of the Mescalero Apache. During 1876, she was escorted across the West by a man, an outlaw. His given name was Harold Kane, but he was known throughout the West as Hurricane. This is both a code name describing what he can do, and we're going to get there, I'm not going to spoil it here, but it is also a bastardization of his name. Harold Kane, Hurricane. There you go. When we enter their story, they're in the woods, on top of a small hill or ridge. Kane and Little Cloud are both loading guns, as Little Cloud spies on the men that are hunting them. Little Cloud's parents had left the tribe a while back in order to work with traders up in Canada. When they had finally settled in enough to send for her, the tribe couldn't spare any braves to escort her. So the medicine man contacted a man who owed him a favor, Harold, and for 2 weeks they have traveled. Harold has said little to her, and almost nothing about him indicated the kind of speed that he was famous for. When she tried to interact with him, he ignored her. And then she tried to help him clean his guns. And then he talked to her. And she still wasn't impressed, honestly. And to be honest, she still wasn't impressed. He wasn't a very good shot at all, regularly missing game when hunting. She could load his guns faster than he could. How can he be the fastest gun in the West, the world, he corrects, if he's this slow? Calmly, Harold says that it takes danger, real danger, for it to kick in. He tells her to cover his horse, Chipper, who is just covered in guns and ammunition and like nothing else, and then they start to scan the valley for their pursuers. As they do, Little Cloud remembers when he told her how it happens, how he got his powers. He had lived with the Mescalero for about a year, helping them translate or helping them deal with the whites. Little Cloud was just a little kid back then, of course. One night, the medicine man called him over to the fire and gave him this big speech, one that he was too dumb to understand, his words. He offered Harold a great power. A gift, a curse, who can say? Well, Harold said yes. He was told to hold his hands out over the fire, and he did. They didn't burn, though. It felt like the air tingling before a lightning storm. In exchange for this gift, the medicine man told him to leave them and to return in 10 years, when the flowers bloomed. In the morning, Harold woke up on the other side of the valley. He figured the medicine man meant it when he said 10 years. So, we bounce forward 10 years. Harold and Little Cloud are waiting to ambush their pursuers. Little Cloud has her ear pressed to the ground, listening for the hoofsteps of horses. Suddenly she lifts her head, and they've been ambushed. And not by like a dude or two dudes. We're talking at least 9 men shown on the page. And one of them mentions having 100 of them against one of him, so there's probably more that I can't see. The posse orders Harold to step out to where they can see him, and he puts up his hands. He asks if Little Cloud can stay out of the way of the gunfire, over by his horse. She sure can, one of them says. He is the one that they want to kill, not her. Little Cloud moves over by Chipper. One of the men asks if now is the time to see the Cyclones quick draw one last time, and the one smart man here says, no! That is where folks screw this crap up. They should just tie him up to a tree and then shoot him and be done with it. But Mr. Genius is shot down. Little Cloud interrupts the narrative with another flashback, used to explain why Harold has so many enemies. When he first got his powers, he was pretty cocky about it. He took bets on his quick draw, but then the power didn't always work. So he quickly got into debt when he would lose those bets. When he couldn't pay the debt, he then got in danger, and that's when the power would kick in. And then a lot of men died. That's how he became known as the Hurricane, leaving devastation everywhere that he went. So he left these parts, and he just tried to keep his head down. Little Cloud told him the stories that she and her tribe had heard, the legends and folk tales that grew up around him, about a man dressed in a colorful costume who could run across the valley like lightning and shoot impossible targets. I mean, it was kid stuff, like something you would read in a comic book. The reality, of course, is much different. Although when Harold is done preparing for this 100-to-1 shootout, she does comment that he has a costume. Yellow effects around the cuff of his shirt resemble lightning, and his body is positively wrapped in gun belts. He has 6 guns strapped to his body, 2 at his hip, 2 at his chest, and 2 over his shoulders. All of the other men have already drawn. Whenever you're ready, Hurricane. Harold's hand floats near his hip. You first. Slowly, quietly, one of the men pulls a trigger, and in the following minute, Hurricane kills them all. For Little Cloud, the moment feels slowed down, and that is how it's presented to us, as one long-held breath. She says that she's not sure if the magic that affected Hurricane is now affecting her because of her connections to the Mescalero Apache, and that's why she's able to witness this moment, or if it's just something that happened, but oh my god. The bullets in all 6 of Hurricane's guns are fired, hitting the closest threats first. Then he went low, scaring the horses so that they would throw their riders, and then he could shoot them. In a moment he was out of bullets, and so Little Cloud started tossing guns from Chipper. Hurricane caught each gun as if he knew where they would be, and then he kept on shooting. Until, eventually, all of the men were dead. Later on, people would call this a massacre, never believing that it was 1 man against 100. But Little Cloud saw it all with her own eyes. Finally, the moment passes. The men are dead, and the guns are dry, just clicking as Hurricane keeps squeezing the trigger. He lowers his arms and looks over the field of bodies. Slowly, he takes off his hat and looks at Little Cloud. "The posses keep getting bigger," he says, "and he can't afford all the ammunition." Together, they gather the best guns and ammo, load them onto Chipper, and then start on their way again. It would still be a long time before Little Cloud reached her family, but now she knew that she was safe, riding with the man called Hurricane. Jeff Parker has become a favorite author of mine over the years, and I think that he is really underrated, just in general. The structure of this particular story works very well, by which I mean the intermingling of flashback scenes and the modern present-day ones. Each flashback informs the next modern moment, so we aren't only learning about Hurricane, but we are setting up story beats too. Our story is mainly related by Little Cloud, keeping us at a distance from Hurricane. This is true for the whole story. It might be about Hurricane, but we don't really get to know the man, the person behind the myth. Little Cloud is the head that we are inside for this one. The Coker's artwork even reflects this idea by keeping Hurricane covered in shadows for most of the story. The entire story, we don't even see his face. It is generally blocked by his cowboy hat or the shadow from it until the very end. Only after he kills the posse does he take his hat off and we get to see his face, at the same time that Little Cloud tells us that, quote, "the legend is gone. All that is left is the man," end quote. And within that idea, we get some of the best storytelling. Harold isn't good with people because he's always alone. He's always alone because he's either hunted by men who are out for revenge for those that he has killed, or because people fear the disaster that he brings. I'm immediately reminded of Vash the Stampede from the anime Trigun, where most of what is feared about this character comes from how others treat him, while he's a pretty normal guy otherwise. Hurricane didn't go into this looking for trouble and death, it came to him, and it's going to keep on finding him. Hurricane in the story is actually a slight reimagining of an already existing character. Harold Kane originally appeared in Two Gun Kid issue 79, originally released back in 1964. He was part of a criminal gang that Two Gun stopped, and, after escaping into the wilderness, Harold met a medicine man at a campsite. The medicine man was brewing a potion in order to make the braves of his tribe faster, but Harold drank the whole thing himself. This gave him enhanced speed, making him about as fast as a jackrabbit. And while that is certainly fast, it ain't super speed like Hurricane is depicted having here, and man, that's a vague way of measuring speed. You're as fast as a jackrabbit. Hurricane would appear again in Western Gunfighters Volume 2, Issue 3, where he battled Carter Slade, the OG Western Ghost Rider, who was then known as the Phantom Rider. And finally, he would go on to appear in West Coast Avengers, where he teamed up with a bunch of Old West bad guys in order to battle the West Coast Avengers, along with the Living Totem, by the way, who we met last episode. Nothing in this story really contradicts these previous stories at all, which is nice. When Little Cloud is relating the stories that she has heard about him, though, we actually see Coker adopt an art style similar to the comics of the 60s, depicting Hurricane in his much more superheroic costume that was used back then. Parker is doing a bit of the old John Ostrander here, implying that the older comics are stories or legends that were told about Hurricane, while this version that we are reading about is the real one. It's a fun revamp of the character, I gotta say. I love Coker's darker, more realistic art style. It pairs really well with Parker's dramatic dialogue and narration. I like reinterpreting Hurricane as this haunted man who is cursed by his success. He's fast, yeah, but like the Gunhawk in Strange Western's The Midnight Gun, that speed has only made him a target. And I like that, much like the yokel there, Hurricane can't aim for crap, but in this story he can fire so quickly that it just doesn't matter. You shoot enough shots and you are bound to hit something. The yokel in the midnight gun only fires off 3 shots out of 6, so it is cool to see the same basic idea used here, but with Hurricane's experience changing it so that it works for him. I really enjoyed this. This is one of those stories that going into it, I had no idea what to expect out of it, and I'm really pleased at the end of the day, both by its presentation and its artwork, and also in the way it takes an old, small Western character and really lifts them up into something interesting and dramatic with a lot of depth to them. This is one of those times where we get a fairly short story, but the author and the art team do a really good job of filling that story with interesting ideas and depth to the characters. I really like this one. Our second story was written by Fred Van Lente, drawn by Holmes, inked by Chris Justice, and was colored by John Proctor. It's called The Man from Fort Rango. A quick blurb just over the title tells us that the Acoma tribe are being moved to reservations as part of the United States' move west. Major Brett Sabre, our lead character, has been tasked with bringing the holdouts in line, and we find him and his men working their way up a steep mountainside. Major Sabre is a white man, probably between his 20s and 30s. He has long blonde hair and a few days of beard growth along his jaw. About 5 men follow behind him, 2 of them lugging a large cannon that is on wheels. They complain about the hard work, and I do not blame them. And as Major Sabre berates them, we also get some background information. The holdout that they are heading towards is named Jack, and we are told that his renegades are holed up in lava tubes and caves that run through the mountain. Jack is outnumbered and outgunned, but he has the best defensible position he possibly could. Major Sabre is hoping to fire a few shots from this butte in order to shake his opponent loose. The men set up the cannon, and while their leader is surveying the distance with a spyglass, they find petroglyphs carved into the surrounding rock. The carvings are very simplistic, but there is a clear through line to them, that of a monstrous, cat-like figure roaring at whoever is looking. One of the men suggests cutting them out of the rock. They could get some nice money for these back east. But Major Sabre orders them to leave them alone. Not for reasons of respect, though. No, the Major's unit is set to escort someone from the Natural History Museum in a month, and he will not jeopardize that job with their greed. While the Major is talking, his men discover a small cave nearby, hidden by bushes, and indigenous warriors slip out of the cave and kill them all. Save for Major Sabre, who is clubbed in the back of his head. When he wakes up, his arms are tied behind his back, and his own sword is aimed at his head. His enemy, the man named Jack, stands before him. The other Braves are busy acquiring the cannon, setting it up to fire, back on the Major's own camp. We get a back and forth between the Major and Jack for a little bit. We learn that Jack has killed Indian agents, or people authorized by the American government to negotiate with indigenous tribes or with homesteaders. These were just normal people who were living their lives. They never hurt anyone. But Jack sees them as sad victims of the American government's bad policies. He will wipe this land clean of all life before his tribe, the Acoma, share land with their hated foes. His men light the fuse on the cannon, but Major Sabre suddenly jumps forward. He slams into the cannon, spinning it around, and when it finally goes off, its load is fired at their feet. The hollow butte is shattered, and all of the men tumble in and down. In the chaos, Jack disappears into the dark tunnels and caves. He has been walking these tunnels since he was 5, he says from the shadows. He's fine. His men, unfortunately, weren't so lucky. They fell underneath the cannon, and they have been crushed. Major Sabre somehow is fine, for the most part. He uses a sharp rock to cut his bonds, and he tries to reason with Jack. If Jack surrenders now, Major Sabre will talk to an Indian agent for him, see that the Acoma are transferred to another reservation, one without the Kisani. Jack isn't buying it, though. He knows how the reservations are, surrounded by soldiers, starvation, and disease. No. He sneaks up on the Major, but light glints off of the sword that he had stolen. Sabre prepares himself, eyeing the knives held in dead hands at his feet. Then he dives and rolls just as a gun is fired from behind him. He scoops up a knife, hurls it at his attacker, and Jack cries out in pain. The knife sinks into Jack's hand, forcing him to drop the gun and sword. The Major picks his blade back up and gives chase, but as he enters a cave, he finds a scene out of a horror movie. 9 dead men are scattered about a cave, its walls lit with wooden torches. They are torn open and blood pools at his feet. Major Sabre is horrified, and so is Jack. He dives on Sabre out of nowhere, demanding to know how he could do this. But Sabre and his men didn't do this, and suddenly a great force rips the 2 men apart. Jack is suddenly pinned against the nearby wall by a cat man. He is about as tall as an average man, but is covered with brown and red hair. His nose is bent forward like a cat's nose, and long fangs rest in his mouth. Pointed claws tip each hand. Jack stammers underneath this creature's hand. Can't he sing his death song? Major Sabre tries to stop this beast, shouting that Jack is a prisoner of the United States Army. He needs to release him. And as Sabre charges, the beast does release him by tearing his throat open. The beast then swings an arm, knocking Sabre back while reprimanding him. You white faces think that we're all the same. He, meaning Jack, was a coma. Heart like fire. This monster is Kisani. And that's why he had to die. Their rivalry has gone back hundreds of years, as old as the land itself. His family has protected this land from the Akoma scum for centuries. So go! He roars, and Major Sabre sees a keg of lit dynamite on the floor, and he starts running. Tell your great father in Washington that you might rule this land, Heart Like Fire shouts, but only so far as he allows it. We suddenly see a massive explosion outside the cave. Sabre's unit of soldiers falls back, coughing as the thick dust billows out. From within that dust comes a shadow. And finally, Major Sabre. He immediately gives orders while coughing, trying to get a perimeter set up before Heart Like Fire can escape. But his men think that he is referring to Jack, and it's going to take them years to dig him out of that mess, if he's even alive. Instead, they congratulate him on eliminating such an enemy. He's going to make colonel now. But Sabre isn't really interested. They need to apprehend him and warn the Major at Lost Mesa, and he remembers everything that just happened. The old hate between the Akoma and the Kasani, the unbeatable creature and its declaration that the white man can't stop them. How many more people would die if he pursued that creature? And for what? To remove the Kasani from land that has been theirs for centuries? He's already lost the men who were on the cannon squad. Does he really need to lose more? The men waiting for orders asks, "What do you need, sir?" And Major Sabre shakes his head. Nothing. The Akoma were wiped out in that explosion. The Kisani have lost Mesa to themselves now. At least, that's the only explanation that people are going to believe. As we hear his final words, we are shown the carved rock again, the one with the petroglyphs from earlier. The carved face of the beast man stares back, its mouth wide and fangs exposed, like a triumphant smile. This story is interesting to me because it has a similar concept as the Hurricane story, actually. Both of these stories are told through the perspective of someone close to the superpowered individual involved in it. In the first story, it was Little Cloud telling us about Hurricane, and now here we have followed Major Sabre into his confrontation with this Old West version of the Puma. I don't have much history with the character named the Puma. In fact, here, I learned about the Puma from this Spider-Man Fleer Ultra card set that I was collecting when I was a kid. Like, I had never read or heard of the Puma other than this card. Let me read it to you. Hang on. Yes, I do have a binder of cards next to my recording setup because I'm still finishing some of these card collections. And to be quite honest, I just like flipping through them and looking at them. Like, what's the point of having a card collection if you're not going to sit around and enjoy it every once in a while? Puma. Origin. The product of mystical rituals and controlled breeding, Thomas Fireheart abandoned his Indian tribe and used his warrior skills to begin a career as a costumed mercenary. Powers. Puma has super strength, enabling him to lift up to 12 tons. Wow. He's a skinny guy for 12 tons. He also has enhanced animal senses and is an accomplished martial artist. Comic universe. Rescued from near death by Nocturne, the totally bestial Puma accompanied her on a crusade to eliminate society's predators, only to be stopped and returned to humanity by Spider-Man. There, you folks now know everything that I know about the Puma. The internet, though, tells me that the Puma was originally created in 1984 as, obviously, a Spider-Man villain. The Puma is the finest warrior bred, trained, and granted mystical powers by the Kisani tribe in order to protect the world as part of some kind of doomsday prophecy. In the modern Marvel times, his name is Thomas Fireheart, CEO of the multinational Fireheart Enterprises in Hartsdale, New Mexico, and he has a long and convoluted history with Spider-Man. He has been an enemy, he's been an ally, a rival, and has often worked in order to settle a non-existent debt that he feels exists between him and Spider-Man. The version of the character that we see here is presumably an ancestor of Thomas Fireheart. Not only is he also of the Kisani tribe and designed to resemble the Puma, just in older clothing, but his very name, Heart Like Fire, is an echo of Fireheart. So author Van Lente is expanding the history of the Puma here, which I think is a really cool idea. We've seen a lot of Marvel heroes explore historical legacy characters in the past 10 to 15 years. Iron Fist, the Black Panther, the Sorcerer Supreme, as well as other characters, and I like getting to see an indigenous hero get that same kind of focus. Given how long tribal people lived on the American continent, it would make sense for them to have a long and storied history featuring these kind of folk heroes themselves. It is a little disappointing that Puma is basically treated as a threat here, and that Major Sabre, who is our audience stand-in character and hero, has very few positive traits to endear him to us. He is fine with enforcing the orders to move the Akoma and Kisani together, and he only wants to protect the petroglyphs so that his future mission will continue to go well. This is a man concerned with following orders and making a good impression, not a man concerned really with doing the right thing. His only real redeeming quality was that he doesn't want to kill Jack and his men outright. He was trying to dislodge them from their defensible position, sure, but his goal wasn't to slaughter them all. And when Jack does actually confront him in the cave, even after he gets that sneak attack on Sabre, the Major does try to talk him down and just capture him. So I suppose that there is that. Then we have the Puma show up, and he points out that Sabre's seemingly heroic attitude is all a lie. He doesn't understand the Akoma or the Kisani, despite being charged with their care, and he isn't interested in their welfare or their history. This ends up culminating with the Puma outthinking and overpowering Sabre, having killed all of the Akoma and then set the cake of dynamite, either to kill or drive away Major Sabre and his forces. Either way, the Puma wins. He proves how utterly powerless the United States military is in this situation. And sure, Sabre could tell the military and Washington that the Kisani are still here, that they're protected by some kind of animal warrior beast man that he can't really describe very well, probably, who slaughtered nearly a dozen men by himself on his own and who needs to be eliminated. Sabre could bring the entire might of the United States military down on Lost Mesa. But he doesn't. By the end of this story, he is humbled and maybe a little bit scared. It's an interesting contrast to our last story, which saw Little Cloud reassured by what she had seen and experienced with Hurricane, where Sabre is rattled. Pun intended. Interestingly, this is not the first appearance of Major Brett Sabre. The Good Major originally debuted in Western Gunfighters back in 1970, where he occasionally teamed up with Red Wolf, who was secretly a scout for the United States military named Johnny Wakely. Sabre would go on to become one of the first senators of South Dakota, so that is a nice bit of history. And I wonder if Van Lente isn't maybe saying that this interaction with the Puma between the Acoma and the Kasani is what makes Sabre a little bit more understanding and a little bit more welcoming to Johnny Wakely when he does meet him later on in his life. And goes on to make him an ally of Red Wolf when Johnny Wakely puts on the costume and the name. That's a pretty cool bit of cause and effect. Holmes's artwork is good here, if fairly unnoticeable, I'm afraid to say. There's nothing bad about the artwork. The characters look right, the pages flow well, everything for the most part makes good sense. His interpretation of the Puma is intimidating and monstrous, which is great, because in this particular role, he really should be. This, however, is one of those good art is not great art kind of moments, I hate to say. Holmes does a good job, but not a good enough job to be memorable for me. He has gone on to be quite the prolific and awarded talent in the European comic scene, so at the very least, that's great to learn. I digitally flipped through a few pages of a book called She that he did interiors on, and they are gorgeous. The coloring, though, is what really elevates those pages, and Holmes did the coloring, and they're just, wow. I don't do a lot of European comics called bande dessinée, but I might see if English versions of She are available. I'm always willing to try another comic. Our third story in this issue is written by Carl Kessel and has art by Carmine Di Giandomenico, the same team that brought us Amazing Fantasy issues 13 and 14, featuring Vegas. But this time, they're telling us the legend of Red Wolf. This time around, the story is narrated by an indigenous man, who we find hung by his wrists between two trees. We're inside of a short canyon lined with dry trees. A small campfire burns on the ground, and a bunch of white men are gathered around. Several of them have been working our narrator over. His face is beaten and bleeding. Their conversation tells us that Mr. Fincher, who is dressed in purple and green, the classic colors of a comic book bad guy, has been claiming the horses owned by our narrator's tribe. However, once Fincher puts his brand on those animals, no one questions his right of ownership to them. But the narrator tells us that Owayodata, the wolf god, was watching him that night. He can hear Owayodata growling in displeasure, and we can see dark clouds, like the fur of a wolf, overhead, and thunder rolls across the landscape. A storm's a-brewin', or a wolf god is hunting. Fincher pulls his brand out of the fire, preparing to mark our narrator. But as the hot metal closes in, a wolf's howl suddenly cuts through the night air. Fincher tries to play it off, it's just the wind. But his men argue otherwise. "No, that's a wolf, sir," one says, and our narrator looks up, whispering, "Red Wolf." And now Fincher's men start to freak out. They've heard stories about Red Wolf. About how this one time, Red Wolf attacked Fort Rango and nearly killed everyone there, until Sergeant Sabre beat him back, of course. Another one heard that Red Wolf was raised by wolves in the wilds of Montana, that, naked in the snow, wearing only a wolf pelt, he tore the throat out of a buffalo with his own teeth. The last one heard that Red Wolf is half man, half wolf, and that he can shift between the two shapes. Bullets can't stop him unless they're blessed. Some say that burning would help, though. "Yes, I'm sure," Fincher says, "and I bet you heard all of this over whiskey from half-drunk fools." He is clearly not impressed by these legends. This is when our narrator adds his story. The Red Wolf was chosen by Owayodata to fight for all tribes. His strength, speed, and cunning are drawn from every red man killed by the whites unjustly. Their crimes will not go unpunished. Red Wolf will see to that. Lightning and thunder split the night. For a moment, Fincher finally seems troubled by the tales. Then he dips forward, pressing the brand into the narrator's chest. These thunderstorms put him in such a bad mood. This is when the sky splits open, and Red Wolf falls amongst the men. He wears a wolf's pelt over his muscular back, the head obscuring his face. Short blades are tied into his fur-covered forearms like mini Wolverine claws. In one hand he wields a leather cloth, supple like a whip, and in the other is a long wooden spear, both ends tipped with blades. He moves amongst the men like a storm, slashing, tearing, and stabbing. The men do a decent job to fight back, though, and Red Wolf is forced to back up into the surrounding woods. One of the men aims a pistol into the darkness, only to be pounced upon by an actual wolf. Fincher aims through a claw-marked face, but his shot is ruined by stampeding horses. During the chaos, Red Wolf managed to free the narrator, and they climbed onto the horses that had been stolen and drove them back through the camp. Afraid of being trampled, the white guys ducked to the side of the canyon, scarred mentally and physically by this night. Red Wolf and the narrator escape, and once far enough away, they stop riding. The narrator is high on adrenaline, though. He knew that a Wyodatta would save him. And their people's horses. This is awesome. This is like being saved by Superman for him. But those poachers should have paid with their lives, he says. Red Wolf should have killed them all. Red Wolf smiles calmly in reply. If no one lived, then no one could tell the story of what happened. He falls from his horse. During the fight, Red Wolf had indeed been wounded. Blood loss has finally claimed him from a bullet wound in his abdomen. The narrator rushes to his side, but it's too late. There's nothing that he can do with his own meager skills. The wolf howls again, and the narrator knows what he has to do. He has been chosen by a Wyodatta, left alive in order to carry this story on. He dons the wolf pelt, ties on the claws, and picks up the spear. He was not the first man to be Red Wolf, and he doubts that he'll be the last. Red Wolf is more than just one person. He's the embodiment of an idea, of a need. Wherever Red Wolf is needed, that is where he'll be. This story I love. It's not a great character piece. I actually think that in terms of demonstrating and introducing me to a character, that the story featuring Hurricane probably did the best job in this book, but I love so many of the things here. First off, I'm kind of in love with this book's use of indigenous peoples and cultures. We haven't seen a lot of that in these Mighty Marvel Western one-shots, and I would argue that we have seen very little representation in general in all of these Western books, despite the huge impact that native tribes had on the Western story in real life. Over the course of these 4 one-shots, we haven't had a single indigenous person in a starring role at all. And then here with this issue, we suddenly have 3. What's more, I like that they are all utilized in different ways, too. Little Cloud is our narrator in the Hurricane story. She is meant to be us in that situation, watching along and being amazed. We start out the story actually thinking that she is in danger. After all, she needs to be escorted, and her point of view, being our main one, makes us think that she is the critical character to the narrative. But Harold is the one bringing the danger, and I can't help but think how much safer Little Cloud would have been if her chief had chosen a different gunfighter. So she isn't a girl to be protected in that story like I expected from the start of it. Instead, she ends up becoming the Hurricane's partner, helping to oil and load his guns and then scavenge the corpses of his victims. She isn't helpless or a victim at all. In fact, she is treated as an equal in that story. Then, in The Man from Fort Rango, we have the Puma as the monstrous villain. I think that Van Lente is intentional in portraying Major Sabre as slightly unconcerned about the morality of his orders, because a white man in the military in the late 1800s, generally speaking, would be. Sabre is not a hero, but then again, neither is the Puma, not really. He slaughters Jack's men, and he is willing to kill Sabre with that dynamite in order to make his point. The Puma rattles us as the reading audience. We have been rooting for Sabre in order to save the day in this story, and then the Puma comes in and literally blows all of that up. Sabre has no business getting involved in this conflict between the Akoma and the Kisani, and it leaves me, at least, feeling a bit shaken by the story. Who was the good guy in that story? Who was the bad guy? The Puma certainly looks monstrous and he does kill those men, but I mean, Sabre was a soldier. Surely he had killed men before as well. And obviously we were shown that he was more concerned with completing his mission than being a good person. Van Lente challenges our sense of right and wrong with that story, and I love that idea. Then here in our final story with Red Wolf, we are presented with the indigenous person being unequivocally the hero of this story, both in the person of Red Wolf and in our unnamed narrator. I actually even love that the narrator goes unnamed, because who he isn't important. What's important is that he picks up the role of Red Wolf and continues the good fight. That is dope, and it continues the concept of a legacy hero that we saw a little bit of in the Puma story. And we even see a direct bit of continuity between our two stories, with Fincher's men retelling the legend of Fort Rango. When I first read this issue, I took this connection to be something completely different from what it is. In my mind, the retelling that we get here is clearly meant to be a nod to the Puma story that we just read, just seen through some whiskey and a long game of drunken telephone over time. Depending on how detailed Major Sabre was with his story upon his return to Fort Rango, you could easily confuse the Puma for Red Wolf, who was generally more active in the Old West anyways. So I could see that legend getting mixed up with this one, and thus we get our reference. But then I did that bit of background research on Bret Sabre, and learned that he actually appeared in Red Wolf's original comic back in the 1970s. And that muddles things a little bit. Because as someone unfamiliar with that history, it is clear to me that my original interpretation must be the right one. That Major Sabre talked about the Puma's attack one drunken night and his men changed details or blew it out of proportion, and that makes total sense to me. But if you do know the history of Bret Sabre and Red Wolf, then it totally recontextualizes this scene. Instead of being told about the conflating of two different Western legends, this is instead about nodding back to old continuity. That Red Wolf did know Bret Sabre, and that Red Wolf did attack Fort Rango. This actually has nothing to do with the Puma story at all. And honestly, I think that's a bit disappointing. It was so cool to me that in a book called Western Legends, we have one of those legends actually retold by someone within the story. The man from Fort Rango isn't just something that we, as the audience, were privy to. It is something that was talked about, something that was told from person to person within the world. That sense of continuity is great, and it makes me wonder if the other two stories mentioned are nods at other bits of Marvel continuity, you know? I could easily see the story about a man raised by wolves being a nod to Wolverine's history, as he did spend some time in the woods with a pack of wolves somewhere in the 1800s. I don't remember the exact timeline for Wolverine's childhood. And the third story about Red Wolf being able to shift between human and wolf form could just be a good old-fashioned nod to werewolves, which we know existed in the Marvel West thanks to the Two Gun Kids one-shot last episode. I would love it if Kessel was nodding to the broader picture of the Marvel West. Like, that's the kind of continuity that gets me hyped up. And those stories still work, honestly, even if they aren't direct nods to continuity, where the Red Wolf at Fort Rango is a direct nod. Kessel does play with the transformation idea a bit in his own story, though, which is, again, a little detail that I really like. When Red Wolf gets wounded and backs up into the woods, and then we see a wolf diving out of the shadows, I mean, I could see a retelling of that attack by these men becoming one of Red Wolf turning into that wolf before finally escaping. Get a few beers into one of these guys and then do a bit of telephone with their bar buddies, and sure, Red Wolf becomes a werewolf. Why not? We also see our first major shift in Red Wolf's concept here. Previous iterations of Red Wolf have all been built around the idea of Red Wolf acting as a bridge between the whites and the indigenous peoples. Whether that's Ostrander's version, who had failed so much in that mission that he just gave in to hate and wanted to kill whites, or Zimmerman's version, who had worked to fit in with white society, that concept has always been present at the very least. This version is the first version of Red Wolf that recasts him as an avenging spirit of indigenous tribes, period, hard stop. Kessel even adds the idea that the Red Wolf is the embodiment of all the indigenous peoples killed wrongly by whites. So now Red Wolf in this story isn't a bridge anymore trying to connect the two peoples. He's indigenous Batman. And I kind of like Red Wolf being a wholly indigenous force. It's very moral of Lee's original concept to present a character that wants both sides to get along. But it also feels very weird to have an indigenous person trying to be the one to smooth things over with the white settlers that were stealing their land and animals, and the United States government that was actively working to oppress, kill, or relocate people who had been there for centuries. It can't fall on one man to make all of that right, much less one of the men who was being oppressed. There's no ask of action from the white culture that was invading at the time that they need to stop, that they need to consider the feelings of these other people. So it is cool to me to have Red Wolf kind of draw this line in the sand and defend his own people. I actually kind of like that. I do realize, of course, that it is necessary for both parties in a conflict to come together in order to find a way forward. But when the American government regularly goes back on its word, or outright lies about how it wants to come together, when justice isn't present, well, that's when you get some vigilante justice. Di Giandomenico's artwork works much better here than it did in Vegas' story back in Amazing Fantasy. His pages are laid out much better and work with Kessel's script really well here. I do think that Kessel wrote a bit less with this story than he did in the Vegas story, which certainly helps the artwork. The three smaller stories that we're told about Red Wolf, the legends part of this story, are all colored differently from the rest of the narrative. First in red, then in green, then in blue, if I remember correctly, indicating that those particular panels are depicting stories and not facts, which is always a welcome visual feature when doing flashbacks. If I have any complaint about the man named Hurricane story, it's that Coker did nothing to differentiate his flashback sequences from his ongoing present-day time period sequences. There was no way to communicate that the narrative was changing there other than in Jeff Parker's writing. I particularly love the way that Di Giandomenico frames Red Wolf during his attack. When he first lands and he's pouncing on a guy, Giandomenico has the two forelegs of Wolf's pelt smack against the man's chest. Combine that with his open, yelling mouth and the wolf head that is on top of his head, and it kind of looks like an actual wolf has pounced on the man, which is super neat visually. And when we see Red Wolf duck back into the woods, I actually lost track of him in that panel. There's just so much going on, and it's framed in a way that Red Wolf isn't really the focus of that panel. It really allows him to slip out of the story and into the woods, and then he comes back in after the wolf attack on those horses. And that's a great bit of visual storytelling. I really was impressed by some of this. Oh, and the small story idea of the cloudy, stormy skies being a physical representation of Owayodata, the wolf god's presence, is a super cool idea to me. I love the idea of the thunder being Owayodata growling. Of course, that makes perfect sense to me. I love it. When I was a kid, I always had a crush on wolves. I think they are beautiful, gorgeous animals. And so getting them a little bit uplifted to gods and having them be this important force is just cool to little 8-year-old Ben. I absolutely love that stuff. So I had planned to cover the rest of this issue in this episode and just finish off the whole Mighty Marvel Western event so that we can move on to a couple of standalone one-shots. But I ended up having way more to say about this issue than I thought I would going into it, so I'm actually going to break this one in two. There is enough story material in the 3 Silver Age stories that end this issue to warrant another episode, and I wanted to give both the modern stories and the Silver Age stories their due. So I think that this is the best thing that I can do. So if you're really itching for this little cluster of books to be done, well, I'm sorry. But if you are having a blast with these, like I am, then hey, good news! Next week, we'll learn the factual, the original origin for the Rawhide Kid. We'll also see the story of the Gunslinger and his quest to avenge his brother. And finally, to wrap this issue up, we'll learn about the man that they call Outlaw. Join me in a week for Comic Book Breakdown episode 19.15, Western Legends Part 2, The Silver Age Stories. Everyone, there are a million podcasts vying for your time and attention, and I'd like to thank you for listening to mine. If you would like to get in touch with me to share a concern, request a series, compliment me, berate me, whatever you like, send me an email at cbbreakdown@gmail.com. Otherwise, thanks for listening.